In today's video, we're going to learn how to paint hair in watercolor pencils. Welcome back to my channel. If you are new here, my name is Michelle, and on this channel we do all things watercolor, including watercolor pencils like today's video, some drawing techniques, even a little bit of mixed media and motivation for artists too. Please do consider subscribing. Unlike many channels on YouTube, we are fully CAT approved and we'd love to have you join us. Watercolor pencils are amazing for texture and for linear marks, so they're really fantastic at making hair in your portraits, whether or not you're doing just watercolor pencils or perhaps you're combining them with watercolor paint. I'm going to show you how to create really realistic hair. We're going to look at all sorts of things from the texture to layering, even the color choices. Now, I will be using just a little bit of pure watercolor paint in this tutorial as well, but if you only have watercolor pencils, I'm going to show you how to get around that issue right now. Now, if there's one disadvantage to watercolor pencils is that they sometimes leave lines when you want a really smooth effect. So just occasionally it's worth turning them into paint before you start, or using ordinary watercolor paint. So before we start today's video in full, I'm just going to show you how to do that. So here's my watercolor pencil. Now I've got this Caran d'Ache palette. This is specially designed for turning watercolor pencils into paint. Don't worry if you haven't got one of these. I'll show you an alternative in a moment. It's got a slight texture to it. So we're just going to draw on it like this. Activate it with water, and now my watercolor pencils are turned into paint and there's absolutely no chance of lines being left behind. So this is just occasionally when you want a really smooth effect, perhaps for an underwash. So maybe you don't have one of these very posh palettes. Let me show you what you can do instead. You can simply use a textured piece of watercolor paper. This is going to work too. The only reason the palette is a little bit better is that some of the colour is obviously going to sink into this paper, so you get all of the colour activated if you use that plastic palette. But this works absolutely splendidly as well. So if during this video you see me using any ordinary paint alongside my watercolours, you don't have ordinary watercolour paint, you just have watercolour pencils, this is what you do. It can be quite daunting painting a large amount of hair and sort of thinking, where do I even start? We're going to start with an underwash. We're also going to do some embossing. So I've got some examples of hair here in some little photograph snaps, and we can see that within each type of hair and each hair colour, there are light and dark areas. So we're going to start with an underwash. Now you might be thinking, should we perhaps not, reserve some light areas, either using masking fluid or something else? But the truth is that it's really not suitable for hair because human hair is so fine. So we are going to find some ways of putting on those light hairs at the end. If, for example, you've got light hairs like these, or you're perhaps doing someone with grey hair and there's some pure white hair in there, or any lighter hair, I'll show you how to do that at the end. So we're going to start with an underwash. As I said, I'm going to use paint, but you can just use your watercolor pencils as I showed you previously to turn them into paint. So you want to be looking at the area that you're painting and considering which parts of the person's hair you want to have a soft edge on the outside and which to have a hard edge. Now, if you paint a hard edge on dry paper, we can still take some individual hairs outside of that edge. So you might, for example, find a harder edge with someone that's got straighter hair, and we can just put our underwash on like this and get that sort of hard edge, perhaps with a little bit of shaping to it. But there are times that you might want to do a soft edge. Now, when would this be? This could be somebody that's got very curly or very fluffy or afro hair. You might want to do a soft outside edge because this hard edge may tend to just show up too much at the end. Another time you might do a soft edge is if you're painting next to the person's face and you want to make sure you really get those soft hairs coming over the facial skin, or any lost edges. So a lost edge is where one thing blends into a shadow area and you really can't see the difference. So say you had some hair laying against someone's neck and there's a very dark shadow and you actually can't see where the shadow ends and the hair begins. That would be a lost edge. So anywhere that we want a soft edge, what we'll do is we'll take clean water on first. You want to place your water on so it's not puddly. And then we're going to paint next to it. Again, don't use paint that's too drippy wet because it'll spread too far and bleed. If that happens, just dry your brush and lift some of the excess water out. Here we have a nice gimlet cat hair, I think that is. And we're getting a soft edge. So you want to start by placing an underwash down over the main areas of hair, using hard and soft edges wherever you think you need them. Now these underwashes have dried and they're perfectly good, but they're quite plain. Let's look at another way that we can add a little bit more texture as we're doing the underwash, and we're going to use an embossing tool to start getting some linear marks even before we go in with our watercolor pencils. Now if you don't have one of these, you can use a ballpoint pen without ink in it, or any other hard point that's not going to cut your paper. You can actually use a scalpel as well on its side, but that's a little bit more dangerous because we're going to go in while the paint's wet and there's a chance you could cut your paper. But if you've got nerves of steel, feel free to have a go at that. I'm going to use a slightly darker color this time so you can see the effect. What we're going to do is, while the paint is still wet, you can do it beforehand as well, but it tends to have more an effect if you go into wet paint. And what we can do here is we can start getting some linear marks with our embossing tool. And what's happening is we're making a dent in the paper and it's attracting the pigment and giving us some very subtle, darker textured lines that look very hair-like. You get different types of embossing point, from wide ones like this to narrower ones that I'm using here. And you can see how we're already getting a slight effect of a hair texture. As with any new technique, do practice before you go in to your main painting. Let's look next at colour choices. So let's look at colour choices. I've got here my museum pencils by Caran d'Ache, and there's 40 of them. So I'll immediately start by taking out any of the neutrals. So that would be, greys, browns, beiges, even black, anything like that. So I'm going to pull those out. I'm also going to pull out a purple and a pink, and I'll tell you why in a moment. So I've got loads of colours here. Now, obviously, I wouldn't use all of these colours if I was doing someone's hair. I might only use 2 or 3 colours. It would depend on the type of hair, but I've got some browns here. I've got some greys. I've pulled out a black. I've also, as I said, pulled out a pink and a purple. Those are for the purposes of adjusting colours, which I'll explain in a moment. I'm just looking at this one, actually. I think that might be... Oh, it is a grey. I thought for a moment it was a green. I thought I pulled a green out. That's a Payne's grey. I've also pulled out my white and an ultramarine blue. So let's have a look at some of these colours. I'll start by swatching some of these lighter colours. This one's French grey. Now I can see that this might be a useful colour for blonde hair. You see how it looks when we water it down. I've also got some warmer light colours which could be used as well. That's a very pale one. I've got a yellow ochre here. And don't forget that these colours can be mixed together, so we can take the brightness out by just mixing a little bit of the next one in. I've got more of a medium brown here, a redder brown and a darker brown. So this one, I haven't looked at the colour name, but it's very sort of raw umberish. I've got more of a sienna colour here. Now this one here looks to be a very useful colour. So I think it's called bark or something like that. But the equivalent of this one would actually be a sepia in paints. And I'll make sure that I list all of these colours in the video description. I've got a soft, fairly warm grey here. Again, that would be a useful one for blonde hair. I've got a much cooler, almost blue grey. Great for painting grey hair. I've got a Payne's grey, which is traditionally a darker blue grey. I've got a very rich oxide type red here. This is going to be good for redheads. That again would need muting a little bit. It's a bit bright in places, almost tends towards a pink. Now I've got black and white, so let's look at those. Now black can be useful for painting hair, but it can also look quite dull on its own, which is why I pulled out the ultramarine for people that have got that real raven black hair. And black hair often tends either towards brown or it tends towards blue if it's a very dark black. You may find that a little bit of ultramarine is just going to give it that depth of colour, make it much stronger, much darker, and give it that blue-black effect. And you want to use ultramarine for that, not some kind of turquoise blue. I've got a white, so this one's in need of a sharpen, isn't it? Now, white isn't overly useful for painting hair. Of course, we can mix it in with things and, bit of pink in this already. It's picked up on something. You can mix it in and sort of get some more creamy colours going on, but it's not actually very useful for getting white highlights. So we are later on in this video going to use a touch of white gouache. Now, if your paint's completely bone dry, you may find that you can get a few hints of white or lighter hairs by going on top with some dry white pencil, but generally speaking, they just don't have the coverage power that a white gouache has, and we'll talk more about that when we come to use it. Now, I've got two other sort of non-hair colours here for mixing. So what I've got here is I've got a purple or a violet. I've got a lighter one in my box as well. And then this one is a crimson, which will water down to a pink. So what do we need these for? We need these for if we accidentally get some green happening in our hair. So why would our hair accidentally go green? Because some of these pigments, as you see, have much yellow in them. And some of the greys, grey being majority blue, and particularly Payne's grey, which is a blue-based grey, if we end up mixing this with our yellow ochre, we can accidentally get green. Let's see if we can make that happen. It may or may not happen. It depends really on the pigments that have been used. Each manufacturer will use different pigments. Let's pop these next to each other and see if we get any greenish tones appearing. And there we are. There's definitely a hint of khaki appearing there. So this is how we can accidentally end up with green in the hair. Now the answer is to go in with either, if it's very dark hair like a brown, you might want to go in with a purple, which is a mix of blue and pink, or you can go in with lighter hair with a little bit of pink, and pink being the opposite colour of green will neutralise it. If you've got paint, that may be a little easier to blend in, but you can see how we neutralise that colour with pink. Over here it's green, here we have neutralised it back to a greyish brown. So your purples and your pinks are fantastic for adjusting any areas that might have gone a little bit too green. Now, of course, this is a great selection of colours for natural hair. Many people nowadays dye their hair lovely bright colours, so if you've got someone with pink or blue hair, of course you'll want to make the most of using the rest of the colours in your box too. Next, we're going to start layering and beginning to add in that linear hair texture. So here's an underwash that I made earlier. This is fairly straight, fairly light coloured hair. And what we're going to do now is we're going to start working on top on dry paper initially with our watercolour pencils and building up some texture. We've already got that texture from the embossing, so it's already looking quite natural. Always take your pencil stroke in the direction that the hair grows. If you've got a hard edge like this, don't be afraid to go a little bit outside of it. And you can build up lights and darks. This one here is quite blunt, but if you want, as you go through, to build up and start getting some more individual hair textures on top, then you'll want to sharpen your pencil. Think of it as a process of working in multiple layers. You may want to wet it and then let it dry again and then work on it again. I can blend where I need to. Remember that different brands as well will dissolve different amounts. Some of the cheaper brands don't dissolve as well, which can sometimes be an advantage if you want individual hairs to be left showing at the end. And I can start building up areas of light and dark. Now I have picked up a darker pencil, but I'm going now on top of damp paper, which means the pencil will release more pigment. Hair tends to sit in sort of clumps where hairs go alongside each other. And even if someone's hair is one colour completely, it doesn't have highlights or lowlights or natural areas of grey or blonde areas, there will still be different colours and different lights and darks within the hair simply because of the reflection of light. So this is your next stage to start building up layers of your watercolour pencils. Let's look now at how hair overall tends to sit in sort of clumps and main areas of movement. We're also going to look at curly and afro hair that's not completely straight like mine. When my friend Farah comes to stay, she often asks to borrow my hair straighteners. I don't have any hair straighteners. This is just my hair. So here's an underwash I did in preparation for some curly hair. Oh, we have another cat hair here. He's molting because it's spring and he's decided to lose all of his fur, and yet he still seems to produce more fur. I brush him every day, but the fur never stops. So even if the curly hair is fairly dark, you want to go in initially with reasonably light colour because you can't take your watercolours lighter. We are going to use a little white gouache, but generally speaking, we want to work light to dark. So I'm going in, first of all, I've got those light areas, and I've also done some embossing, and that's going to help me to get an idea of some curls going on here. Now you want to think as well about darker areas in between, more shadowed areas in between. So we might perhaps shade some of these areas, and I'll show you more as we go through the video how we get those areas where you can't really see any individual hairs. And you want to think, especially with curls, that you'll get lighter ones that catch the light, and then the darks will be in the gaps. So I might want to go in with some lighter coloured pencils as well. I can wet the whole thing, or I can just work in areas and start softening some of these areas. Remember, when you're working with darks like this, you might need to frequently rinse your brush. Depends how dark the hair is. If you don't mind the whole area going a little darker, you don't have to rinse as much. So we can go in with the brush there. And then again, we can start working in on a damp surface, and we'll actually start to get a lot more pigment being built up. And again, just the same as with the straight hair, you may want to go in multiple layers because there'll be times when it starts getting a little bit damp and you actually want those areas to dry before putting another layer on top. It's all about building up and building up. So at the moment, it's quite rough looking. The more layers you build up, the more you'll get those subtle hair textures appearing. You can always go in with some lights as well, remembering always to go in the direction of hair growth. And of course, on a wet surface, you can shade much more easily to get those dark areas in between, but you will then want to go in with a brush too. On the first pass, you want to concentrate more on the actual texture of the hair and worry less about the shadow areas, because as we work up and work through the picture, we can blend out the shadow areas with our brush, and I'll show you how to do that towards the end of this video. Let's look now at how to add shine to the hair. We're going to bring in a little bit of white paint and also a little bit of dry brush technique. Now don't worry, you can just use your watercolor pencils, your white watercolor pencils for this. I'll talk more about that as we go through the demonstration. So I've got here some white gouache paint. This may sometimes be labelled watercolour. This is titanium white, so it's got a lot more covering power than zinc white, which is sometimes called Chinese white. And what we're going to do is a dry brush effect. Now you don't want to use one of your best paintbrushes. You want to use the scruffiest, oldest paintbrush in the world. And here it is. This one is so old that it literally falls apart. I've had it for years, and there's nothing like it. The more it falls apart, the better it is for dry brush work. You can also use something like a jagged fan brush, and I've chopped into this one myself. You can buy specialist tree painting brushes if you've got any of those. Those are great too. Basically, you want a stiffer brush, so something that's meant more for acrylics than watercolor. The bristles should be stiff and they should have some kind of jagged edge. Now, you really can't get these effects particularly well except by using paint. And what we're going to do is we're going to go in like this, and I would try this on a scrap of paper first. You don't want to blob it, but you know, if you do, it's not the end of the world. And you're just picking up the tiniest amount of dry paint. You see I haven't even mixed any water with it, and we can start to get these tiny fine lines. You can also use a little bit of black if you want. And you might think to yourself, but Michelle, there isn't white hair in this, it's just light blonde or whatever. But because this is gouache, it's a type of watercolor, it's going to show the other colors through. It's not going to be completely opaque, and you can always blend it in if you want to. But bear in mind, of course, that when you do blend it in, you'll get some opacity, which for lighter hair colours can be quite nice. As I said, you can use any colour for doing this. Black and white are particularly effective. Blend out the bits that look too harsh, and look at the beautiful shine we're getting appearing on this hair. Now, we don't want our hair to look unnatural and every single hair to be showing on the head of the person we're painting. So there's going to be some areas where we're going to want to soften the hair, either because you can't see all of the texture or more likely because areas are in shadow. Let's look now at how to soften some of these first layers. Now, when you paint a full head of hair, you're going to want to blend some areas out like we did with the white there. So you want a selection between some very crisp hairs, perhaps especially at the edge of someone's hair like this, and maybe some flyaway hairs. You may get some hairs like this going across somebody's skin, but there are also going to be areas where you want to blend, particularly areas that may be in a deeper shadow, perhaps by someone's neck. And what you're going to do there is you're going to bring in your brush and just smooth those areas out. Because if the whole of the head has crisp, fine hairs like this, they're going to look a little bit scarecrowy. It's not going to look very natural. And remember, this really is a process. You don't do it in one pass. You may go back into an area 4 or 5 times, allowing it to dry each time, and adjusting as you want. And if there's an area that's too blended out, you can always go back in either on wet paint like this or on dry paint to keep building up the effects that you want. Now, if you want to know more about the materials I used today or any of the other videos that I mentioned in this video, I'll leave all of that information in the video description. You also want to pop down there because you can grab some free PDFs. There's even 1 or 2 free courses that you can take. Don't forget, I also have that watercolor pencil flower painting course, and coming up later, I mean, it depends, I say later, depends when you're watching this video, but at the time that I'm making it later this spring, that spring of 2024, probably end of May, I'm going to have a full brand new watercolor flower painting course. So excited about this one. You all know it's my favorite subject. So don't forget to have a look in that video description. Meantime, if you enjoyed this watercolor pencils video, I think you're going to find this next one really interesting too.